In the last module, you learned about the smallest musical unit in music, the motive, and the smallest complete thought in music, the phrase. In this module, you will learn about one of the structures that results from combining two phrases together, the period. A period has several specific characteristics that define its existence. It is generally 8 measures long and contains 2 4-measure phrases. The first phrase has a weaker cadence than the second phrase. These 2 phrases generally create a sense of asking a question and receiving an answer. If we think in linguistic terms, the first phrase would be an interrogative sentence, and the second phrase would be a declarative sentence. In music, the first phrase, with its interrogative function, is called the antecedent. The second phrase, with its declarative function, is called the consequent. The antecedent phrase will have a weaker cadence than the consequent phrase. For instance, let's look at the Mozart example from the last module. This is an example of a period. The half cadence at the end of the antecedent phrase is weaker than the perfect authentic cadence at the end of the consequent phrase. It gives the music an impression of incompleteness. The perfect authentic cadence at the end of the second phrase is stronger and provides a sense of closure. Here is another example. Let's listen to this excerpt by Beethoven. The antecedent phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence. This is weaker than the perfect authentic cadence that ends the consequent phrase. The characteristics that make it imperfect, harmonic inversion, not ending on the tonic in the soprano, make it a less strong option than the definitive sounding perfect authentic cadence. Periods can be described in terms of their melody and their cadences. Because of these 2 factors, when identifying a period, you should use 2 descriptors, a melodic descriptor and a harmonic descriptor. First, let's look at the melodic descriptors, of which there are 2. If the antecedent and the consequent phrases both begin with the same or similar melody, then they are parallel. They may be nearly identical except for the cadences, or they may be similar for just a measure or 2. If we return to the Mozart example, we see that the melody of both phrases is exactly the same for the first 2 measures of each phrase. The melodic descriptor for this period would be parallel. If the antecedent and consequent phrases do not have similar melodic content, then they are contrasting. Let's listen to this example by Haydn. Note that the melody of the consequent phrase, while it contains a similar rhythmic motive, does not contain the same or similar pitches to the antecedent phrase. The melodic descriptor for this period would be contrasting. Now let's look at the harmonic descriptors, of which there are 4. If the antecedent phrase ends with a half cadence, and the consequent phrase begins on a 1 chord and ends with an authentic cadence, the period is interrupted. If the antecedent phrase ends with a half cadence and the consequent phrase begins with a harmony other than the 1 chord and ends on an authentic cadence, the phrase is continuous. If the antecedent phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence and the consequent phrase ends with a perfect authentic cadence, the period is sectional. Finally, if the consequent phrase cadences in a key other than the key that the period began in, then the period is progressive. Let's look at a few examples. In the Mozart example, the antecedent phrase ends with a half cadence. The consequent phrase begins with a 1 chord and ends with a perfect authentic cadence. That means that the harmonic descriptor for this period would be interrupted. In this Beethoven example, the antecedent phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence. The consequent phrase ends with a perfect authentic cadence. That means that the harmonic descriptor for this period would be sectional. How about the heightened example? The antecedent phrase ends with a half cadence. The consequent phrase begins on a chord other than the tonic and ends with a perfect authentic cadence. That means that the harmonic descriptor for this period would be continuous. When identifying a period, you must fill in the blanks. There should be 2 words before you say period. For example, the Mozart example represents a parallel interrupted period. The Beethoven example represents a parallel sectional period. And the Haydn example represents a contrasting continuous period. You must take time to memorize the melodic and harmonic descriptors for periods. We will return to period construction often, especially in future discussions on form.